Here's everything you need to know about the seventh house in traditional astrology. The seventh house is probably one of my favorite houses as far as traditional astrology is concerned because of the type of astrology that I practice. Whenever I give a reading, I tend to focus on the angular houses and the second house. People often like to talk about their seventh house, even if they don't need to talk about their seventh house. And the reason for that is because who doesn't want to talk about their romantic prospects in this lifetime and whether or not they're going to meet their prince or princess charming in the subway or in Whole Foods or wherever? The seventh house is the house of love and romance. Within modern astrology, we tend to speak about the seventh house as the house of the other. But the reality is that modern astrology tends to be very vague. And so saying that the seventh house is the house of the other is a very vague thing to say because which other? Who are these people in my closet who are faceless and nameless? So no, from the perspective of giving a reading, the seventh house is not going to be the house of the other. The seventh house is going to be the house of your lover. 10 times out of 10, the seventh house is going to be the house that directly pertains to your spouse, your lover, the person who you have sexual relationships with, the person who you have any form of intimacy with, as far as love and romance is concerned, is going to be in your seventh house. Because astrology is a tiringly patriarchal system, within traditional astrology, we are told that the seventh house is the house of the woman. And the reason for that was because they must have assumed that only men got readings, which means that the seventh house naturally ended up being the house of their wives. Why do we consider the seventh house to be the house of the wife? Because if we apply the Chaldean order of Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon to the 12 houses, Saturn grants us our body in our first house, Jupiter grants us the gift of food in our second house, Mars grants us the gift of having brethren and blood relations in our third house. The Sun grants us the gift of having a family and particularly to have a father in the fourth house. Venus grants us the gift of children and pleasure within our fifth house. Mercury grants us the gift of having servants and people to help us within this lifetime in the sixth house. And the Moon grants us our wives in the seventh house. That's the rationale. Period. If you do not have a wife and if you have a husband, the fact of the matter is the seventh house is the house of the person who you marry. The seventh house is the house of the person who you're dating. The seventh house is the house of the person who you randomly have sexual relationships with once every 2.5 months. Oftentimes within traditional astrology, we need to distinguish between the house itself and the ruler of the house. The seventh house, if you have planets terrestrially located in your seventh house, it is going to be indicative of how you receive the topic of love in general. What is your idea about love? What is your relationship to love? What has love felt like to you up until this point within your lifetime? Whereas if you have planets in the seventh house and the ruler of the seventh house as another planet, the ruler of the seventh house is going to represent your specific lover and the story that tends to manifest more so frequently within your life as far as your lovers are concerned, whereas the planets in the seventh house are going to represent the general topic of love and romance in general. So in general, you might have an argumentative and contentious relationship with love in general, but you and your spouse, i.e., you and the ruler of your seventh house, are actually doing quite great. But when you look back at your lifetime of love relationships, you have an angry Martian love relationship pattern because you happen to have Mars terrestrially located within the seventh house. However, now that you've grown older and you found the ruler of your seventh house because the two of you accidentally met in Costco or Whole Foods, you realize even though the story that I've told myself about my love relationships has been contentious and challenging, my story between me and this specific person, ruler of my seventh house, is actually quite lovely. So that's how we would distinguish between you having planets in the seventh and the ruler of the seventh. If you have no planets in your seventh house, that does not mean that your love life is going to be empty. All it means is that the ruler of your seventh house has to do double duty insofar as that planet is now commissioned or entrusted with both representing your relationship to the topic of love in general, as well as your relationship to your specific partner specifically. Every house is having planets that are having an analogous relationship to that house from a traditional astrological perspective. In Jyotish, these planets are called the karkas of the houses or the vehicles of the houses, whereas in Western astrology, I guess we couldn't be bothered to give them a name, so we just call them the planets that have an analogous relationship with the houses. It's a mouthful, but the point of the matter is the seventh house, just like all the other houses, are having planets that are having an analogous relationship to it. For example, Venus, clearly, is going to have an analogous relationship to the seventh house because Venus is the goddess of love. Venus is the Aphrodite of Rome. Venus is the Oshun of the Yoruba people. Venus is the goddess of love and beauty and all of the things that we do with our genitals from the perspective of finding intimate connection with people within the world. So Venus is naturally going to have an analogous relationship with the seventh house. And if you have Venus in the seventh house, this can indicate that you have harmonious love relationships. And it can also indicate that your relationships in general tend to be with people of a more Venusian nature. This is also another thing I want to say about the seventh house. When you have planets terrestrially located within the seventh house, it can be descriptive of the quality of partner you're manifesting. So you might manifest a Venusian artistic type of person, or maybe your husband looks like Clark Kent and has a dimple in his chin and a dimple in his face and dimples all over the place because apparently back in the day, dimples were thought of as being a mark of beauty within and amongst traditional astrologers. So very often, a person who has Venus or who is signified by Venus is supposed to have a love dimple in their chin. So maybe you have a very attractive partner, somebody who is very photogenic. Both sides of their face are symmetrical. It's a Venusian type if you have Venus in the seventh house. Jupiter also does well in the seventh house. However, there is a caveat and a catch here. Jupiter does well in the seventh house when Jupiter is doing well. It can represent that your partner is a jovial, lovely person with a very large laugh and very large features in general, which could be very, very nice, if you know what I mean. Jupiter in the seventh house could also represent that you're having a partner who just wants to do well for everybody and who wants to share themselves with everybody. And at this point, this is when our pink flag starts to turn to a red flag because I don't know about you, but I don't really want for my husband or boyfriend to want to share himself with everybody because whoa, 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 where does that start and where does that end is the question. The issue with Jupiter is that the Jupiterian doesn't really know where it starts or where it ends, and sometimes Jupiter in the seventh house, within a chart in which the ruler of the seventh house is also afflicted, can represent infidelity and having an unfaithful spouse. All of these things are what we find with having the king or the god of plenty in our seventh house in a chart where the ruler of the seventh house is also afflicted. Moon in the seventh house says that we tend to have a lot of traffic with people in our lives in general, and that's all it says. But if astrology is meant to hold true in general, then having the moon in the seventh house could say that you have a very nurturing partner, and that person might also be a little bit emotional, a little bit clingy, but that person is a clingy, emotional, protective person within your life. Mercury in the seventh house could indicate that you have a very talkative, chattery partner in general, and that's somebody who is delightful and humorous and who keeps you young and who keeps you on your feet. And probably that person even likes to travel. Probably that person is even a little bit younger than you. Probably that person is a brainiac and knows a little bit about everything, because those are the attributes of Mercury specifically. Now, for the planets that do not have any natural analogy with the seventh house, Saturn is not having no analogy with no house. And the reason why Saturn has no analogy with the seventh house is because Saturn denies. When it comes to the seventh house, I don't want for my lover of the year or my lover of my lifetime to be denied by anyone. But Saturn in the seventh house is something that can deny love, or it can cause you to only find love later on in life, or it can also be an indication of you falling in love with somebody who is particularly older than you. So, all of these things are things that we find when we have Saturn in our seventh house. Mars in the seventh. Mars is having an analogous relationship with the seventh house, but the only reason why Mars has an analogous relationship with the seventh house is because the seventh house is the house of our open enemies, and Mars is the god of war. So, the seventh house is the house of love and romance, and tangentially is the house of open enemies. And in the 17th century, those patriarchal bigots said that yes, because Eve ate the fruit, and as a result of that, she threw Adam and the whole race of mankind into calamity, and it's her fault. That's why she's our open enemy in the seventh house. Whenever a group of men come together to talk poorly about women, it always makes me wonder what those group of men are doing amongst themselves. Everybody in the 17th century had issues with the women, and we'll just leave it there. So, the seventh house is also thought of as the house of our open enemies, and therefore Mars is having a naturally analogous relationship with the seventh house because Mars represents warfare. Very often, when we have Mars in the seventh house, our marriage turns into a space of warfare, particularly if this is supported by other testimonies within our chart. And even long after the marriage is done, we can find ourselves still in a state of continuous court battles with our previous spouse. So that's Mars in the seventh house. The most positive way this can manifest is that Mars in the seventh house can represent being married or in a relationship with somebody from a martial field, whether that person is a police officer, a firefighter, a defense force officer in the army, or some other martial fiery occupation. But more often than not, it represents that the partner is a martial fiery person, and therefore it causes you to have a martial fiery marriage, which could be good in the bedroom, but it isn't necessarily going to be good universally as far as creating a home that feels harmonious is concerned, especially if there is nothing else within the chart to stave off some of the more wrathful components of Mars. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, none of them do well within your seventh house. Pluto conjunct the cusp of the seventh house can oftentimes represent being in a marriage with somebody who is commanding and demanding and who doesn't actually prioritize you as being the center of their own world because they're so deeply caught up in prioritizing themselves as being the center of both of your worlds. So that can be Pluto in the seventh. And the positive side that this can manifest on is it could bring you a partner who is very convincing and who probably has a very successful career and is very wealthy as a result of that. However, more often than not, Pluto in the seventh could represent being in a relationship with somebody who is overly forceful and commanding and demanding in your life, and somebody who feels like they're dragging you by the hair to the underworld. Neptune in the seventh house could represent being in a relationship with somebody who is disappointing. In general, as far as the seventh house is concerned, any planet in the seventh house could be thought of as being a planet that is having a direct conjunction to our Venus. And the reason for that is because Venus is the universal significatrix of love. Therefore, any planet in the seventh house is very similar to having that same planet in a conjunction with our Venus, or even in a conjunction with the ruler of the seventh house. So having Neptune in the seventh house can be an indication of being in a relationship with somebody who's a disappointment. Maybe you get married to that person very young because you have some summertime fever dream about you and that person being together for the rest of your lives. And then you realize very quickly on that this person is a kleptomaniac. He steals all the things from your mother's home. Your mother's cat went missing, and it's because your boyfriend stole it from your mother because he's so connected to this tendency and this addiction to stealing in general. Or the other side of this could be that you're probably in a relationship with somebody who lies. When we have Neptune conjunct the seventh, we tend to not see our partner clearly until it's too late, and then that person manifests as ashes within our mouths. And at that point, we've already married that person, had children with that person, and we realize that we probably can't easily extricate ourselves from that relationship. That is having Venus conjunct Neptune. That's also having Neptune conjunct the seventh house cusp. Neptune conjunct the seventh house cusp could also be something that we see within the charts of people who are having relationships with people who are unwell. Either unwell because they've made themselves unwell through an addictive tendency such as alcoholism, or unwell because they are just physically unwell within their physical bodies, and therefore the person whose chart it is has to end up taking care of their spouse later on with time. Neptune in the seventh isn't really the best thing in the world. The most positive way that Neptune in the seventh can manifest is that you fall in love with an artist or with a holy person or with a yoga teacher or with a healer or with something to that effect. But if you're just falling in love with a regular person, chances are, especially if there are other things within your chart that support a challenging love life, chances are that Neptune conjunct your seventh house cusp is going to manifest as disappointment within your relationship. Uranus on the seventh is something that we oftentimes associate with divorce. This is something particularly true in a horary astrology chart about love, and you find Uranus conjunct the seventh. Even if you find Uranus rising, it symbolizes divorce, period. Even if there aren't other things to support that within your chart. However, if there are other things to support it within your chart, it definitely is a signature of divorce. It's a signature quite similar to Venus Uranus, where the relationship starts quickly and the relationship ends quickly. The positive of this is that the person who you're in a relationship with could be a very exciting and brilliant and amazing person to be around, who keeps you excited and who keeps you gassed up and pumped up. And there's never a dull day with this person, but it doesn't really represent the greatest amount of stability within that relationship. And finally, we don't really like to see any of the nodes in the first house or the seventh house. And the reason for that is because if I'm blessed to have the north node in my first house, then I end up with the south node, aka the toilet bowl of the universe, in my seventh house. And if I am cursed to have the south node in my first house, and we say cursed because that's what the ancients would call it. But we know that within the 21st century, we've all learned how to turn our strawberries into pineapple, into the lemons into lemonade. And as a result of that, having the south node in the first house need not be that much of a detrimental thing to us from a health perspective. However, it can be challenging from a relationship perspective because very often when we have the south node in the first house, it means there is an unfair power dynamic between us and our partner, where our partner seems to be getting the upper hand because we got stuck with the toilet bowl in our first house and our partner got blessed with the beautiful, illustrious north node in their own house, which is the seventh house of our chart. So those are the planets that we enjoy seeing in the seventh, as well as the planets that we don't enjoy seeing in the seventh. And hopefully this is helpful to your astrological practice.